In the quiet suburb of Maplewood, the Turner family had always found solace away from the bustle of urban life. Nestled at the end of a tranquil cul-de-sac stood the modest yet welcoming home of Margaret, a 64-year-old woman whose life revolved around her family. After the tragic death of her daughter, Hannah, in a car crash a decade earlier, Margaret took on the role of guardian for her two granddaughters, Claire, now 33, and Emily, who had just turned 19. Claire had married a man named David, and their life together seemed idyllic. They had a cozy house not far from Margaret's, a place Emily often visited. To Margaret, her granddaughters were her world, and she had devoted herself to their upbringing after Hannah's passing. David, who had been a part of the family for years, was seen as a responsible and supportive husband, the kind of man any family would be proud to call their own. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy, something sinister lurked, a truth that Margaret would uncover, setting off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. It all began innocuously. Emily, a lively young woman on the brink of adulthood, didn't immediately notice David's unsettling behavior. He started with compliments that felt slightly off, his touches lingered a bit too long, but Emily brushed it off, thinking she was overreacting. After all, he was her brother-in-law, and they were family. But David's behavior grew more brazen, his intentions becoming clearer. The once harmless gestures turned into something more disturbing, making Emily increasingly uneasy in his presence. One evening, when Claire was out with friends, David cornered Emily in the kitchen. The air was heavy with tension as he spoke to her in a low, suggestive voice, praising her beauty in a way that made her skin crawl. "You know, you're so much more mature than other girls your age," he said, stepping closer. Emily tried to laugh it off, but the fear was palpable in her eyes. She felt trapped, unsure of what to do. When she tried to leave, he blocked her way, his demeanor shifting from charming to menacing in an instant. That night, Emily barely escaped his advances by locking herself in the guest bathroom. Her hands shook as she typed a desperate message to Margaret, explaining what had happened. "Grandma, something's wrong with David. He's been making me really uncomfortable. Please, I don't know what to do," she wrote. She sent the message, hoping with all her heart that Margaret would understand. But before Margaret could even read the message, the situation spiraled out of control. The next day, Emily went to David and Claire's house to confront him, to tell him to stop. She hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would realize how much he was hurting her and her sister. But David's response was terrifying. He denied everything, his face twisting with anger as he accused Emily of lying. The confrontation escalated quickly. David, enraged, shoved her hard, and Emily stumbled back, hitting her head on the edge of the counter. She crumpled to the floor, unconscious, and David, panic-stricken, realized what he had done. He acted quickly, wrapping Emily's body in a blanket and carrying her out to his car. Driving far away from the house, he dumped her body in a remote forest clearing, praying no one would ever find her. When Claire returned home later that night, David was already in damage control mode. He feigned concern, claiming Emily had left in a hurry and he hadn't heard from her since. Claire, worried, called everyone she knew, but Emily was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Margaret was at her volunteer shift at the local community center when she received the message from Emily. Her heart sank as she read the words. Something about the way Emily described David's behavior set off alarm bells in Margaret's mind. She knew she had to act, but she didn't know where to start. She tried calling Emily, but there was no answer. Her worry turned to dread. The next morning, Margaret went to Claire and David's house, pretending to help with the search for Emily. But she was there for more than that. In the bathroom, she found a small but significant trace of blood on the edge of the sink, a clue that confirmed her worst fears. Emily was gone, and David was responsible. Margaret didn't go to the police right away. She knew they would need more evidence to tie David to the crime. Instead, she began her own investigation. For the next few days, Margaret kept her composure, playing the role of the supportive grandmother. But inside, she was seething with anger. She followed David, watching his every move, and noticed him visiting a secluded area outside town. It was there, hidden among the trees, that she found Emily's body, hastily concealed beneath a pile of leaves. The sight of her granddaughter lying lifeless in the dirt broke something inside Margaret. She knew she had to do something, but it couldn't be through the legal system that had failed so many before. One afternoon, when Claire was at work and David was alone at home, Margaret knocked on his door. David, surprised to see her, let her in. She confronted him, accusing him of murdering Emily. David laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and denied everything, even as the guilt shone in his eyes. But Margaret had come prepared. She pulled out a hidden voice recorder, playing back the message Emily had sent her. David's face paled as he listened to Emily's fearful voice. He realized then that he was cornered. Margaret's hand moved swiftly, drawing a small pistol she had hidden in her coat. David barely had time to react before she fired. He fell to the ground, his eyes wide with shock, the life draining from him as Margaret watched. She felt no remorse, only a grim satisfaction. She had done what needed to be done. Emily had been avenged. Margaret calmly left the house, returning home to bake a cake. It was a simple gesture, one she had done many times for her granddaughter's birthdays, but this time it was a symbol of closure. She lit a single candle and placed it on the table before calling the police. When they arrived, she didn't resist. She explained everything calmly, from the moment she suspected David to the evidence she had found and why she had taken matters into her own hands. Her confession, delivered with the same composure she used to tell bedtime stories to her granddaughters, left the officers stunned. Claire was called to the station, her world shattered by the news. The man she thought she knew, the man she loved, had killed her sister. The revelation was devastating. Margaret, now behind bars, looked at her granddaughter through the glass and said, "I'm sorry, Claire. But I couldn't let him get away with it." The trial that followed was swift. Margaret pleaded guilty to manslaughter, refusing to defend her actions. The public was divided. Some saw her as a monster, while others viewed her as a hero who had done what the justice system couldn't. Margaret was sentenced to prison, but she wore her punishment like a badge of honor. She had lost everything, but she had also protected her family the only way she knew how. And so, the story of Margaret Turner, the grandmother who took justice into her own hands, became a cautionary tale of the lengths to which love can drive a person, and the tragic consequences that often follow. The torrent of grief, guilt, and anger crashed down on Claire like a relentless wave. Her heart ached for Emily, her sister, who had trusted David, the man Claire had married, the man who had turned out to be a monster. And now, her grandmother Margaret, who had been the pillar of strength in their lives, had done the unthinkable. Margaret had sought justice with her own hands, ending David's life and setting off a storm that no one could have foreseen. Claire was caught in a whirlwind of emotions, devastation over losing Emily, and a confusing sense of understanding toward Margaret's actions. She didn't approve of what her grandmother had done, yet she couldn't entirely condemn it either. Margaret had acted out of a fierce, protective love that only a grandmother could feel for her grandchildren. But it was still too much for Claire to handle. It felt as if everything she knew was crumbling around her. Margaret's trial quickly became a national sensation. The story of an elderly woman avenging her granddaughter's death captivated the public imagination. People were sharply divided. Some saw Margaret as a heroic figure, a grandmother who stood up against the failings of the justice system. Others saw her as a criminal who had let her emotions drive her to murder. In court, Margaret's defense centered on her overwhelming grief and the police's failure to act quickly enough when Emily disappeared. Her lawyer painted a picture of a woman driven to the edge, struggling with the unimaginable loss of her granddaughter and the shock of discovering David's heinous crime. They highlighted the voicemail Emily had sent, the bloodstains Margaret had found, and the emotional toll the entire ordeal had taken on the family. To many, she was just a grandmother who had lost everything and had been pushed beyond her breaking point. The prosecution, however, argued that no matter how much pain Margaret had endured, she had no right to take the law into her own hands. They pointed out the premeditated nature of her actions, that Margaret had brought a weapon to the confrontation with David. They acknowledged the severity of David's crime but insisted that Margaret should have let the legal system handle him. The courtroom was charged with emotion throughout the trial. Claire was called to the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the horror of losing her sister and the betrayal of discovering who David truly was. She spoke about Margaret's unyielding love for her grandchildren, how she had essentially raised them after their mother's tragic death. Her testimony was a poignant moment, and Claire broke down several times as she relived the nightmare that had torn her family apart. When the jury finally delivered their verdict, the courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Margaret was found guilty of manslaughter. The court recognized the unbearable emotional distress she had been under and the trauma she had suffered, but they couldn't overlook the fact that she had taken a life. The judge sentenced her to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5 years. Margaret received the sentence with a quiet acceptance. She had never expressed regret for her actions. As she stood before the court, she said in a firm voice, "I did what any mother or grandmother would do. I protected my family. David got what he deserved, and I have no regrets." As Margaret was led away, Claire watched, tears streaming down her face. She had already lost Emily, and now she was losing Margaret too. It felt as if her entire world was collapsing. In the months that followed, Claire struggled to piece her life back together. She was haunted by guilt for not seeing the truth about David, guilt for not being there when Emily needed her most, and guilt for what Margaret had endured. Claire sought solace in therapy, attempting to make sense of the trauma and the loss that had shattered her family. It was a long and difficult process, but she knew she had to keep moving forward. She sold the house she had shared with David, unable to bear the memories that haunted its walls. Each room seemed to echo with the ghosts of her past, tainted by the betrayal and the lies. Claire moved into a small apartment closer to her job, hoping the change of scenery would help her heal. She visited Margaret in prison once, a few weeks after the trial. It was a painful visit, filled with silence and unspoken words. Claire didn't know what to say, and Margaret, though strong, knew that her granddaughter was suffering in ways she couldn't mend. After that visit, Claire decided not to return. It wasn't that she blamed Margaret for what had happened, she simply needed time to heal, to find her footing in the shattered remnants of her life. Eventually, Emily's body was discovered in the remote forest where David had left her. The discovery allowed the family to lay her to rest and brought a sliver of closure. The funeral was a quiet affair, attended by close friends and relatives. Margaret's absence was keenly felt, but Claire stood resolutely, lighting a candle for her sister and praying that Emily had found peace, far from the horrors that had plagued her final days. As the years passed, Claire struggled to rebuild her life. The trauma of losing her sister and the betrayal she had experienced left deep scars. Trusting others became nearly impossible, and she withdrew into herself. But slowly, she began to find ways to cope. She started painting, channeling her pain into her art, and joined support groups for people who had endured similar losses. Little by little, she found a path forward, though the memories of what had happened would never truly leave her. Margaret, from behind bars, never wavered in her belief that she had done the right thing. She wrote letters to Claire, filled with expressions of love and steadfast conviction. "I did what I had to do for Emily," she wrote in one letter. "I know you may not agree with my actions, but I couldn't let him get away with what he did." Claire read the letters, but she seldom replied. She understood why Margaret had done what she did, but the pain was still too fresh, too overwhelming to put into words. The tale of Margaret, the grandmother who avenged her granddaughter's death, became a legend in the community, a story of love, loss, and a desperate act of vengeance. Margaret's actions sparked debate, dividing people into those who saw her as a hero and those who viewed her as a criminal. For Claire, the story was far from over. She carried the weight of the past with her, the knowledge that her family had been torn apart by secrets, deceit, and the harrowing truth of David's crimes. Margaret would eventually be released from prison, but by then, the damage had been done. The family that had once been united was now fractured, and Claire knew that some wounds would never fully heal. It was a story not just of justice, but of the lengths one would go to for love, and the profound consequences that can follow. And so ends another episode of Whispers in the Dark, where we delve into the darkest corners of the human soul and the stories that haunt us. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping tales of real-life crime and intrigue. Until next time, stay vigilant and cherish those you hold dear.